Hi everyone, welcome to today's lesson with Eileen Chevalier's Typewriter Alphabet Flashcards. We are going to look at the life cycle of plants today. Angiospermae begin life in a tiny seed and mature into a plant that can produce seeds of its own before dying. In this lesson, we'll look at the big picture of the life cycle of an angiosperm. The materials that you're going to need for class today are, of course, your typewriter alphabet flashcards. The one in particular that we're going to look at today is the letter K. So it's a picture of kudzu, and on the back we're talking about the life cycle. You'll also want to get out, if you have them, one of the books that we don't use as much, but it's a really great reference book not only for botany but for lots of the biology topics, is the Usborne Illustrated Dictionary of Biology. So we're going to look at that a little bit today. Their life cycle page goes over botany but also animals, so it's a little more broad in that way. And then we'll look at this book, A Seed is Sleepy, and that is really great. Even though it's a picture book, the illustration that they have for it's not exactly a life cycle page because it doesn't go all through the death of the plants, but it goes from seed to seed. So it's a really neat way to compare different types of plants. All right, before we get into it, we're going to write our definitions. So I'll read them out for you and you can write them in your journal. Life cycle: the developmental changes of an organism throughout its life. Germination, growth, reproduction, seeds, and death. That obviously pertains to botany rather than, say, fish, because I'm talking about germination and seeds. But it's the same idea. So, question and investigate. Read A Seed is Sleepy and compare the various life cycles in A Seed is Generous. Why does it take some seeds so long to flower? How is the life cycle related to why pine nuts are so much more expensive than beans? We'll compare pine nuts and beans when we look at that in a minute. Compare how long it takes seeds to germinate by reading Some Seeds Are Ancient, and then looking at the picture of sprouting grass seeds in the lesson video. That's this video. I'll show you that in a minute. What other differences in life cycles have you discovered? So as you learn about the different life cycles of plants, you'll discover lots of really interesting things. But we're just going to look at a few first. So here is A Seed is Sleepy, and again, it doesn't have page numbers, so it's a little tricky, but I just marked my page with the book jacket. So this is the page that we are looking at. A Seed is Generous. You've probably already seen this page because you probably did a drawing of that bean. So the bean is the very first plant that they're talking about, and it happens very quickly. So 2 days after you plant it, it germinates. And then in 4 days, it's already coming up out of the ground. 1 week, it's putting out its true leaves. 4 weeks, you've got a plant. 5 weeks, you have beans. So if you can plant a plant and in a little over a month have the fruit of that plant, that is pretty different. And if you think about how productive beans are, how easy they are to harvest, they're like right there next to you in the garden. So think about that, and then let's compare that with pines. So it takes them a week to germinate, start coming out of their seed coat. And then at 6 weeks, you've got like a little tiny sprout. 2 months, it's in there. It's getting some new leaves on there. 8 years, it's a good tiny tree. And then 15 years, you've got a big tree, and that's when you've got your pine nuts. So 15 years. So if you think about the amount of space versus the amount of food you would get from a bean plant, and the amount of space and not only that time required for you to get pine nuts, it's a pretty big difference. So pine nuts, we think, oh, these are so expensive. But if you think about 15 years, a giant tree, the harvesting of them, All of that is so much more intense, right? So think about those and then look at the other ones and see, okay, does it make sense that the investment put into that plant is reflected in the price of that plant? We've talked about seeds before, and we thought about how we can use the parts of the seed, the characteristics of the seed itself, to make sure it germinates or make sure it doesn't germinate before we want it to. And this is a super fascinating look at a very old seed. Not all seeds are eager to germinate. Some have lain dormant or slept undisturbed for more than 1,000 years, which is phenomenal. The oldest known seed to sprout came from an extinct date palm tree. After it was unearthed from a long ago king's mountaintop palace in Israel, a scientist planted it. 4 weeks later, it sprouted. So it's not necessarily like the planting to the actual germination time, but how long the seed is viable. So a really long time, right? So it didn't take that long. It was 4 weeks later it sprouted. However, I will show you a picture of some grass seed that started germinating before it ever left the plant. So this was in our front yard at our old house. And I love this grass. It's so cool. And I moved a bunch of it under a tree because it really likes shade. And it happened to be a really wet time of year. And I think the grass, it was just really great conditions. So it was getting the right amount of sun. It was getting all of its water. So it wasn't like drying out when it was on the plant. And I just started sprouting right there. So before it ever even came off the plant, the seeds were sprouting, which is pretty fascinating. I was a little blown away. So keep an eye out for those things that are really interesting, like, hey, this plant is doing something that most plants don't do, or just the differences in the range of how long things take. Next question, when reading about the life cycle of angiospermae, the life cycle begins with a seed. What does this mean for the plants that are produced vegetatively? So we looked at vegetative reproduction versus sexual reproduction. So seeds come from sexual reproduction. Vegetative reproduction is just, if I were to take a little piece of this ivy, put it in some water, it starts having new roots, and then I put it in a new pot. Now I have 2 plants, and those were reproduced vegetatively. I didn't have a seed from the ivy. So what about that new plant? Are they still part of the parent plant even if the parent dies? So does that mean that this plant is still alive if that one is alive? Right? So are they different plants now? Even though in the life cycle, we always say it starts with the seed. These are things for you to think about. Did they begin their own life cycle? Did the new plant, this new ivy plant that I have, begin its own life cycle? We can use this one actually, because I've done this. So this is an ivy. You can see all of its roots. It's its own plant. I just cut it off of another plant and started going crazy all on its own. So is that plant, did it begin its own life cycle even though it didn't start with the seed? Or did it start its life cycle when the original ivy started with the seed? Do they have a life cycle that looks different from plants that come with seeds? So just think about that and what those differences are and what the life cycle, what is it that defines what the life cycle is? All right, so in your journal, there are a couple things you can do. First, the best way to examine the life cycle of a plant is to see it in action, right? By growing plants yourself. When you buy seeds, look for a short date to maturity number. Fruits that are usually called vegetables often have these short life cycles. So like the beans that we were talking about, 5 weeks, right? Crazy, that's very short. Try cucumber, okra, and tomato. They're fun and they're delicious. Okra, I just love. The flowers on okra are large, they're gorgeous. They're really, really beautiful. Keep records of your life cycle growing experiment. What day did you plant the seeds? How many seeds germinated? How many seeds developed true leaves? So sometimes you plant a seed and it starts to come up, but it doesn't. Many times, especially with garden plants, you'll see the cotyledons. They come up and you can see them. There are two of them, usually, because it's usually eudicots that you're planting. And then after that, you'll have the first true leaf come, or the true leaves come out after that. So those first ones, you're like, I don't know what kind of plant this is. They all just look the same. They're like these round, really boring leaves. And then the next leaves that come up are the true leaves, and they have all those characteristics that the plant itself will have. So, how many blooms are on each stem? What pollinators visit your flowers? This is a fun one, because sometimes it's like a specific type of pollinator and sometimes it's all different kinds. Like a sunflower are really fun because so many different pollinators come to sunflowers. You've got bees and hummingbirds we would have, and butterflies. Maybe there were moths. I wasn't super paying attention. They're usually later in the day. So keep an eye out for the pollinators. How long did each step take? If you grow an edible flower, taste it and record your observations. So you will learn a lot just from growing the plants, and you'll kind of get a feel for the life cycle of different plants as you plant them and watch them grow. If you're indoors and it's the winter, you can always try those avocados and see how they're doing. A lot of people plant seeds inside in February or January even sometimes, depending on how soon they're going to get them out into the garden. So you can start your plants early, especially if they take a while, and then you can plant them out in your garden when they grow. I've even left the tomatoes too long, and when you have tomato plants and they get really leggy, like the stem is really long, you can actually just dig your hole deeper and just bury a bunch of that stem, and all the roots will come out from there. So try some different things and don't be too worried about it. It's plants. Just see what happens and try to record your observations, especially when you find something fun. All right, guys, we'll see you next time. Thanks.